February 14th, 2021, Valentine's Day. The day Texas froze, the power grid collapsed, and millions of people learned the hard way that modern infrastructure isn't as reliable as we'd all assumed. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm a 52-year-old architect living in a suburb outside Austin. And that week changed everything about how I understood shelter, survival, and what it really means to build a home that protects you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up 6 months, to August 2020, when I started building something that my neighbors thought was absolutely ridiculous, a complete waste of money, and proof that I'd finally lost my mind after my divorce. I'd just gone through a brutal separation, 23 years of marriage ending in lawyers and arguments and the division of everything we'd built together. My ex-wife got the house we'd designed and built, the beautiful modern home with floor-to-ceiling windows, open concept living, all the architectural features that magazines love, and that I'd been so proud of. I got the small lot we'd bought years ago as an investment, a half-acre plot in a neighborhood of cookie-cutter suburban homes, and enough money from the settlement to build something new. I was angry, hurt, and determined to build something completely different from the showcase home I'd lost. Something authentic, something that prioritized function over form, something that would actually work instead of just looking impressive in photographs. I'd spent 25 years as an architect designing beautiful buildings that were fundamentally dependent on modern systems, on electricity and natural gas and municipal water, and all the infrastructure we take for granted. Buildings that looked amazing but would become uninhabitable the moment those systems failed. I'd designed homes with massive windows that created terrible heat loss, with open floor plans that were impossible to heat efficiently, with HVAC systems that consumed enormous amounts of energy. Beautiful, expensive, fragile buildings that only worked because we had reliable power and unlimited fossil fuels. I was done with that. I wanted to build something different, something that incorporated principles I'd studied but never actually implemented: passive solar design, thermal mass, natural ventilation, systems that worked with physics instead of fighting against it. I wanted a home that would be comfortable and livable even if the power went out, even if natural gas stopped flowing, even if all our modern conveniences disappeared. My neighbors thought I was having a midlife crisis. When I started construction in August 2020, they watched with a mixture of amusement and concern as I built something that looked nothing like the other homes on the street. While their houses were wood frame construction with vinyl siding and asphalt shingles, I was building with concrete and stone. While they had large windows on all sides for maximum light, I was carefully orienting my windows to capture winter sun and avoid summer heat. While they had conventional foundations, I was digging down 4 feet and pouring a massive concrete slab with embedded radiant tubing, creating thermal mass that would store heat. The Hendersons, who lived directly next door, were particularly vocal about their opinions. Jim Henderson was a retired oil executive, proud of his big house with its 3-car garage and professionally landscaped yard. His wife Patricia was active in the HOA and had strong opinions about property values and neighborhood aesthetics. They made it clear they thought my house was ugly, weird, and probably going to hurt everyone's property values. "Why are you building with concrete?" Jim asked one day, standing at the property line watching my crew pour walls. "This is Texas, not a bomb shelter." "And what's with all that insulation? You're putting in like twice what code requires." "You know that's just wasted money, right? Our HVAC systems work fine with standard insulation." I tried to explain about thermal mass, about how concrete and stone could store heat and cold, moderating temperature swings, and reducing the need for active heating and cooling. I tried to explain about super insulation, about how investing in a better building envelope would pay dividends for decades in reduced energy costs and improved comfort. But Jim wasn't interested in listening. He'd made up his mind that I was wasting money on unnecessary features, overbuilding for a climate that didn't require it. Patricia was more direct. She told me flat out that my house was ugly, that the small windows made it look like a prison, that the stone and concrete exterior was out of character for the neighborhood. She suggested, not very subtly, that I should reconsider my design and build something more traditional, something that would fit in better with the existing homes. I ignored them and kept building. By October 2020, the structure was complete. 12-inch thick concrete walls with 6 inches of exterior insulation, creating a building envelope with an R value of about R40, more than double what code required. A 4-foot deep foundation slab, heavily insulated underneath and on the edges, with embedded PEX tubing for radiant floor heating. Small, strategically placed windows on the north, east, and west sides, but large south-facing windows with deep overhangs calculated to allow winter sun to penetrate deep into the house while blocking summer sun. A metal roof with a radiant barrier and additional insulation, creating an R60 ceiling assembly. The house was small, only 1,400 square feet, but every inch was carefully designed for efficiency and resilience. The heating system was where I really diverged from conventional practice. Instead of a standard forced air furnace or heat pump, I installed a combination system. Primary heat came from a high-efficiency wood stove with a catalytic converter, capable of heating the entire house and connected to the radiant floor system through a heat exchanger. Backup heat came from a small propane boiler, also connected to the radiant floors, sized to maintain comfortable temperatures even in the coldest weather. And as a tertiary backup, I had a small generator and enough propane stored to run the boiler for 2 weeks if necessary. My neighbors thought the wood stove was particularly ridiculous. "This is the 21st century," Jim said. "We have natural gas and electricity. Why would you want to mess with firewood like some pioneer? What happens when you're not home? What happens when you don't feel like building a fire?" That's what thermostats are for. I explained that the wood stove was about resilience, about having a heating source that didn't depend on infrastructure that could fail. I explained that the radiant floors would store heat for hours, that I could build a fire in the morning and the house would stay warm all day. I explained that this wasn't about rejecting modern convenience, it was about having options, about not being completely dependent on systems I couldn't control. But Jim just shook his head and walked away, convinced I was paranoid and wasteful. By December 2020, I'd moved into my new house, and I was discovering that everything I'd designed actually worked. The thermal mass of the concrete walls and floor moderated temperature swings beautifully. On cold nights, the mass would release stored heat, keeping the house comfortable. On sunny winter days, the south-facing windows would allow sun to penetrate deep into the space, warming the concrete floor, which would then radiate that heat for hours after the sunset. I was running the wood stove most evenings, enjoying the radiant heat and the ambiance, and my propane usage was minimal. My utility bills were astonishingly low, maybe $80 per month total for a 1,400 square foot house in winter, compared to the $250, $300 my neighbors were paying for their larger homes. The house was comfortable, quiet, and felt solid in a way that wood frame construction never does. I was vindicated in my design choices, but I kept that satisfaction to myself. I didn't need to prove anything to my neighbors. I'd built this house for me, for my own peace of mind and comfort, and their opinions didn't matter. Then February 2021 arrived, and everything changed. The weather forecasts started getting ominous in early February. A polar vortex was breaking down, sending Arctic air south, and Texas was going to get hit with temperatures far below anything the state's infrastructure was designed to handle. Forecasters were predicting lows in the single digits, possibly below zero in some areas, sustained cold that would last for days. Most people, including my neighbors, weren't particularly worried. Texas had cold snaps before. You'd turn up the heat, maybe let your faucets drip to prevent frozen pipes, and wait it out. The power grid would handle the increased demand. The natural gas system would deliver fuel to millions of homes. Everything would be fine. I wasn't so sure. I'd been reading about the Texas power grid, about how it was isolated from the rest of the country, about how it had minimal reserve capacity, about how it wasn't designed for extreme cold. I'd been reading about natural gas infrastructure, about how wells and pipelines could freeze in extreme cold, reducing supply exactly when demand was highest. I had a bad feeling about this storm, so I prepared. I brought in extra firewood, stacking it in my garage where it would stay dry. I filled my propane tanks, making sure I had at least 2 weeks of backup fuel. I filled bathtubs and containers with water, just in case. I charged every battery I owned, stocked up on food that didn't require cooking, and made sure my generator was serviced and ready. My neighbors saw these preparations and thought I was overreacting. Jim Henderson actually laughed when he saw me stacking firewood. "You know you have a thermostat, right?" he said. "Just turn up the heat like a normal person. You don't need to prepare for the apocalypse. It's just a cold snap. It'll be over in a few days." "I hope you're right," I said, "but I'd rather be prepared and not need it than need it and not be prepared." The storm hit on February 14th, Valentine's Day. Temperatures dropped into the teens, then single digits, then below zero. Snow and ice covered everything, accumulations that Texas infrastructure wasn't designed to handle. Roads became impassable. And then, starting on February 15th, the power grid began to fail. Rolling blackouts were supposed to last an hour or two, giving the grid time to stabilize. But as natural gas supplies faltered and power plants went offline, the blackouts became longer, more frequent, and eventually, for millions of people, permanent. The power went out in my neighborhood at 2 a.m. on February 15th. I woke up to darkness and silence, no hum of refrigerators or HVAC systems, just cold, quiet darkness. I got up, built a fire in the wood stove, and went back to bed. The thermal mass of my house would keep it comfortable for hours, and the fire would maintain warmth through the day. When dawn came, I assessed the situation. Outside temperature was 8 degrees. Inside temperature was 66 degrees and holding steady, warmed by the wood stove and the thermal mass that had stored heat from the previous day. I had light from my south-facing windows. I had heat from the stove. I had water from my stored supplies. I was uncomfortable, certainly, but I was safe and warm. My neighbors were not so fortunate. By mid-morning on February 15th, with power still out and temperatures continuing to drop, I started hearing from them. Jim Henderson knocked on my door, looking worried. "Marcus, do you have power? Our house is getting cold. The thermostat says it's 58 degrees inside and dropping. How long do you think this outage will last?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Could be hours, could be days. The whole grid is in trouble. Do you have any alternative heat source? Fireplace, space heaters, anything?" "We have a fireplace," Jim said, "but it's gas. Doesn't work without power. And we don't have any firewood anyway. We never use it. It's just decorative." I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. A decorative gas fireplace that didn't work without power. That was exactly the kind of design decision I'd spent my career making, prioritizing aesthetics over function, assuming infrastructure would always work. "You're welcome to come over here if you need to warm up," I offered. "I have a wood stove and plenty of fuel. I can keep my house warm indefinitely." Jim looked at my house, at the smoke rising from my chimney, at the warm glow visible through my small windows. For the first time, I saw something other than condescension in his expression. I saw fear and maybe a hint of respect. "We'll be okay," he said. "Power will probably come back on soon. But thank you. I'll let Patricia know." The power didn't come back on soon. February 15th passed with no power. Then February 16th. Then February 17th. Temperatures stayed brutally cold, single digits at night, barely reaching the 20s during the day. And across Texas, millions of people were suffering in houses that had become uninhabitable, that were designed to be comfortable only when powered by electricity and natural gas, that became frozen boxes the moment those systems failed. By the morning of February 16th, the second day without power, the situation in my neighborhood had become dire. Outside temperatures had dropped to 5 degrees overnight, and most homes, designed with minimal insulation and dependent on active heating systems, were approaching uninhabitable conditions. I woke up to my house at a comfortable 64 degrees, warmed by the fire I'd built the previous evening and the thermal mass that continued to radiate stored heat. I built another fire in the wood stove, made coffee on my camp stove, and watched the sun rise through my south-facing windows, already beginning to warm the concrete floor. My neighbors were in crisis. Around 9 a.m., Patricia Henderson knocked on my door, and I barely recognized her. She was wearing multiple layers of clothing, her face was pale, and she was shivering despite the heavy coat she'd wrapped around herself. "Marcus," she said, her voice shaking, "we need help. Our house is 41 degrees inside. We can't get warm. Jim tried to start a fire in the fireplace with some wood from the yard, but it just filled the house with smoke. We don't know what we're doing wrong. I grabbed my coat and followed her to their house. The moment I stepped inside, I understood the problem. Their home, like most modern suburban houses, was a beautiful showcase that had become a frozen trap. The large windows that provided such wonderful light were bleeding heat at an alarming rate. The high ceilings and open floor plan that made the space feel so grand meant that any heat rose immediately to the ceiling, leaving the living areas cold. And the decorative gas fireplace that had never been intended for actual heating was useless without power to run the blower and control systems. Jim had tried to build a fire using the fireplace, but he'd closed the flue, not understanding how chimneys worked, and had filled the house with smoke without generating any useful heat. Now they were cold, scared, and running out of options. "You can't use this fireplace," I told them. "It's not designed for wood burning, and even if it was, you need to understand how to operate it safely. You're going to have to come to my house until power comes back on." "But what about our pipes?" Patricia asked. "Won't they freeze and burst if we leave?" "Probably," I said honestly, "but frozen pipes can be repaired. Hypothermia can't. You need to prioritize your safety over your property." They gathered some essentials and came to my house, and I could see the shock on their faces as they entered. My small, ugly house with its prison-like windows was warm, genuinely warm, 66 degrees and comfortable. The wood stove radiated heat that you could feel on your skin. The concrete floor was warm to the touch. Sunlight streamed through the south-facing windows, adding passive solar heat. It was a completely different environment from their frozen showcase home. "How is this possible?" Jim asked, holding his hands near the wood stove. "Your house is warm. Actually warm. Without power, without gas. Just with that wood stove?" "It's not just the stove," I explained. "It's the whole system working together. The concrete walls and floor store heat, releasing it slowly over time. The insulation keeps that heat from escaping. The south-facing windows capture solar heat during the day. The wood stove provides active heat when needed. Everything works together to maintain comfortable temperatures even when there's no power." Jim looked around my small house with new eyes, seeing past the aesthetics to the function underneath. "I thought you were crazy," he said quietly. "I thought you were wasting money on unnecessary features, building some kind of survivalist bunker. But you were right. You built a house that actually works when everything else fails." Over the next few hours, more neighbors showed up. The Chens from across the street, their house at 38 degrees with 2 small children who were crying from the cold. The Rodriguezes from 2 doors down, elderly couple in their 70s who were at serious risk of hypothermia. The Patels, the Johnsons, the Smiths, one by one, families who'd mocked my ugly concrete house were now seeking shelter in it because it was the only warm place in the neighborhood. By the evening of February 16th, I had 14 people in my 1,400 square foot house. It was crowded, chaotic, and far from comfortable, but it was warm. I kept the wood stove burning, carefully managing the fire to provide steady heat without overheating the space. The thermal mass did its job, storing heat and releasing it evenly. The south-facing windows provided passive solar gain during the day, and everyone was safe. We organized ourselves as best we could. I showed people how to manage the wood stove, how to build fires efficiently, how to use the radiant heat effectively. We pooled our food supplies and cooked communal meals on my camp stove and the wood stove's surface. We set up sleeping areas throughout the house, with families taking turns using the bedroom while others slept in the living areas. It wasn't comfortable, but it was survivable. And outside, across Texas, people were dying. The news reports, when we could get them on battery-powered radios, were horrifying. Hundreds of people dead from hypothermia, carbon monoxide poisoning from desperate attempts to heat homes with grills and generators indoors, house fires from improper use of fireplaces and space heaters. Millions of people suffering in homes that had become uninhabitable, that were designed to work only when powered by infrastructure that had catastrophically failed. The contrast between my house and my neighbors' houses was stark and undeniable. Their homes were larger, more expensive, more beautiful by conventional standards, but they'd been designed as showcases, as aesthetic statements, with functions secondary to form. Large windows for light and views, without consideration for heat loss. Open floor plans for a sense of space, without consideration for heating efficiency. dependence on active systems, without backup plans for when those systems failed. My house was smaller, uglier, more expensive to build per square foot because of all the extra insulation and thermal mass. But it worked. It kept people alive when their showcase homes had become death traps. On February 17th, the third day without power, Jim Henderson asked me a question that I'd been expecting. "Why did you build like this?" he asked. "How did you know this would happen?" "I didn't know this specific event would happen," I said. "But I knew that infrastructure could fail, that systems we depend on aren't as reliable as we assume. I've spent 25 years as an architect designing beautiful buildings that only work when everything goes right. I wanted to build something different, something that would work even when things went wrong." Jim was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've been thinking about our house, about how we built it. We spent so much money on things that don't matter. Granite countertops, hardwood floors, a gourmet kitchen. But we skimped on insulation because it was hidden, nobody would see it. We chose large windows because they looked impressive, without thinking about heat loss. We trusted that the power would always be on, that the gas would always flow. We built a house that only works in perfect conditions." "That's what most people do," I said. "That's what I did for most of my career. We prioritize aesthetics and assume infrastructure will handle the function. But infrastructure fails, systems break down. And when they do, you find out whether your house is actually a shelter or just a pretty box." The power finally came back on in our neighborhood on February 19th, 4.5 days after it had gone out. When the lights flickered on and the heating system started humming, there was a moment of relief and celebration. People could go home, could return to their normal lives, could try to repair the damage that had been done. But the damage was extensive. Every single house in the neighborhood except mine had frozen pipes. Some burst, some just frozen solid. Water damage was widespread. Some homes had structural damage from ice accumulation. The Hendersons' house had a burst pipe in the attic that had flooded their second floor, causing tens of thousands of dollars in damage. The repair costs across the neighborhood would total hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions. Insurance would cover some of it, but not all, and premiums would skyrocket. My house had no damage. The pipes hadn't frozen because the house had stayed warm. The structure was fine because it had been designed to handle temperature extremes. I'd burned through about half my firewood supply and some propane, maybe $200 worth of fuel total, to keep 14 people warm for 4.5 days. That was my only cost. As neighbors returned to their damaged homes and began the process of repairs and recovery, something had shifted. The people who'd mocked my ugly concrete house, who'd complained about property values and aesthetics, were now asking questions. How much did it cost to build like that? Could they retrofit their existing homes with better insulation and thermal mass? What would it take to install a wood stove or other backup heating system? Jim Henderson was the most vocal about his change of perspective. He came over a week after power had been restored, after he'd gotten estimates for repairing his house and had seen the bills for his neighbor's repairs. "Marcus, I owe you an apology," he said. "I thought you were crazy, thought you were wasting money on unnecessary features. But you built the only house in this neighborhood that actually protected people when everything failed. You saved lives, including mine and Patricia's. We would have been in serious trouble if you hadn't taken us in." "I appreciate that," I said, "but I didn't build this house to prove a point or to be a hero. I built it because I wanted a home that would actually work, that would keep me safe and comfortable, regardless of what happened with infrastructure." Jim nodded. "I've been thinking a lot about how we build houses, about what we prioritize. We spend so much money on things that don't matter in a crisis. Fancy finishes, impressive aesthetics, features that only work when everything is perfect. But we don't invest in resilience, in systems that work when things go wrong. I'm rebuilding after the pipe damage, and I'm doing it differently this time. More insulation, smaller windows, a real wood stove that doesn't need power. I'm building a house that will protect us next time this happens. Because there will be a next time, won't there?" "Probably," I said. "Climate change is making extreme weather more common. Infrastructure is aging and underfunded. The grid is fragile. This won't be the last time systems fail. The question is whether we're going to keep building houses that only work in perfect conditions, or whether we're going to start building houses that actually shelter people when conditions aren't perfect." The aftermath of the February 2021 freeze changed my neighborhood in ways I never expected. What had started as a personal project, building a house that prioritized function over form, had become a catalyst for rethinking how we approach shelter and resilience. Jim Henderson wasn't the only one who decided to rebuild differently. As neighbors repaired freeze damage, many of them incorporated resilience features they'd seen in my house. Better insulation, smaller or better placed windows, backup heating systems, thermal mass where possible. The Chens, whose young children had suffered through those cold days, installed a wood stove and added significant insulation to their attic. The Rodriguezes, the elderly couple who'd been at serious risk, downsized to a smaller, better insulated home that would be easier to heat in an emergency. Even Patricia Henderson, who'd been so concerned about aesthetics and property values, admitted that maybe function should take priority over form when it came to basic shelter. By summer 2021, I'd been approached by several neighbors asking if I'd consult on their renovation projects. They wanted to understand the principles I'd used, wanted help designing systems that would work when power failed, wanted to build resilience into their homes. I wasn't a contractor, but I was an architect, and I understood these systems. I started consulting, helping neighbors retrofit their homes with passive solar features, thermal mass, better insulation, backup heating systems. It became a second career, or maybe a calling, helping people build homes that would actually protect them. The local media picked up the story. A reporter from the Austin newspaper interviewed me about the house that had sheltered 14 people during the freeze, about the design principles that had made it work, about what we could learn from the infrastructure failure. The article went viral, and suddenly I was getting calls from across Texas, from people who wanted to build resilient homes, from architects who wanted to understand the principles, from policymakers who were trying to figure out how to prevent the next disaster. I gave talks at architecture conferences, explaining that resilience wasn't about survivalist bunkers or rejecting modern convenience. It was about designing buildings that worked with physics instead of fighting against it, that had backup systems for when primary systems failed, that prioritized function alongside aesthetics. I showed calculations demonstrating that investing in better building envelopes and passive systems actually saved money over the life of a building, even without considering the value of resilience during emergencies. The response was mixed. Some architects and builders embraced these ideas, recognizing that climate change and infrastructure fragility meant we needed to build differently. Others resisted, arguing that building codes were adequate, that the freeze had been a once-in-a-century event, that investing in resilience was unnecessary and expensive. But the homeowners who'd lived through the freeze, who'd watched their beautiful houses become uninhabitable while my ugly concrete house kept people alive, they understood. They'd learned the hard way that aesthetics don't keep you warm, that open floor plans don't protect you from cold, that dependence on infrastructure is a vulnerability. By 2022, I'd consulted on over 50 projects across Texas, helping people build or retrofit homes with resilience features. Some were new construction, where we could incorporate passive solar design, thermal mass, and super insulation from the ground up. Others were retrofits, adding insulation, installing wood stoves or other backup heating, improving building envelopes within the constraints of existing structures. Every project was different, tailored to the specific site, climate, and needs of the homeowner. But they all shared common principles. Reduce energy needs through good design, incorporate passive systems that work without power, have backup systems for critical functions, use thermal mass to moderate temperature swings, and design for resilience alongside aesthetics. The economics were compelling. A typical resilience retrofit cost $15,000 to $30,000, depending on the scope of work. But it would reduce energy costs by 30–50%, meaning it paid for itself in 10–15 years just from energy savings. And it provided insurance against infrastructure failure, protection that was literally priceless when systems collapsed. New construction incorporating resilience features cost about 10–15% more than conventional building. But again, the energy savings and resilience benefits far outweighed the additional cost. Jim Henderson became one of my biggest advocates. After rebuilding his house with resilience features, he started talking to other homeowners about what he'd learned, about how his priorities had changed, about why investing in function was more important than impressive aesthetics. He and I co-authored an article for a building industry magazine, explaining from both homeowner and architect perspectives why resilience mattered and how to achieve it. The article resonated with people who'd lived through the freeze, who'd experienced firsthand the failure of infrastructure and the inadequacy of conventional building practices. In 2023, Texas updated its building codes, requiring better insulation and more resilient design for new construction. It wasn't everything I'd hoped for, but it was progress, recognition that the old ways of building weren't adequate for the challenges we faced. The code changes were directly influenced by the February 2021 freeze, by the hundreds of deaths and billions of dollars in damage that had resulted from inadequate building design and infrastructure fragility. My neighborhood looked different now. Several houses had been rebuilt or significantly renovated, incorporating resilience features. You could see the changes: smaller windows, better insulation visible in thicker walls, wood stoves with chimneys, solar panels, and battery systems for backup power. The neighborhood that had once been uniform in its conventional suburban aesthetic now showed diversity in approach, with homeowners prioritizing different aspects of resilience based on their experiences and concerns. Property values, ironically, had increased. The homes with resilience features were selling for premiums, with buyers recognizing the value of houses that would remain livable during infrastructure failures. My ugly concrete house, which Patricia Henderson had once claimed would hurt property values, was now seen as innovative and desirable. Real estate agents marketed resilient homes as a selling point, emphasizing features that would have been considered weird or unnecessary just a few years earlier. By 2024, 3 years after the freeze, I'd helped design or consult on over 200 resilient homes across Texas and neighboring states. I'd trained other architects in resilience principles, spreading the knowledge beyond what I could do individually, and I'd seen a shift in how people thought about shelter, from seeing homes as aesthetic statements or financial investments to seeing them as life support systems that needed to work regardless of external conditions. The February 2021 freeze had been a tragedy, with hundreds dead and billions in damage. But it had also been a wake-up call, forcing people to confront the fragility of infrastructure and the inadequacy of conventional building practices. My house, the ugly concrete box that neighbors had mocked, had become a proof of concept, demonstrating that it was possible to build homes that worked when everything else failed. Jim Henderson summed it up well in a conversation we had on the 3-year anniversary of the freeze. "You know what I learned from all this?" he said. "I learned that comfort and safety aren't about having the biggest house or the fanciest finishes. They're about having a house that actually works, that protects you when things go wrong. Your house isn't pretty by conventional standards, but it's beautiful in a different way. It's beautiful because it does what a house is supposed to do. It shelters people." That's the lesson I took from the freeze and from the journey that followed. Shelter isn't about aesthetics or status or impressing neighbors. It's about creating spaces that protect people, that work with physics instead of fighting against it, that remain livable when infrastructure fails. My neighbors were shocked when my floor heated without power while theirs froze solid. But that shock led to understanding, to change, to a rethinking of how we build and what we prioritize. The ugly concrete house that had been a neighborhood joke became a neighborhood refuge, and eventually, a model for how to build homes that actually shelter people in an increasingly uncertain world. My name is Marcus Webb, and I built a house that worked when everything else failed. Not because I was smarter than my neighbors, but because I was willing to prioritize function over form, to invest in resilience over aesthetics, to build for worst-case scenarios instead of assuming everything would always work perfectly. The freeze taught us all that infrastructure fails, that systems break down, and that when they do, the only thing that matters is whether your house can actually protect you. That's the story of the storm that changed everything, and the lesson about resilience that came from watching modern homes become death traps while one ugly concrete house kept 14 people alive.